The Georgia sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Agent Victoria Hayes turned off the highway, her shoulders finally relaxing after another long day at the FBI field office. 12 years she'd been doing this job, chasing down criminals and solving cases that most people only saw on television. Tonight, all she wanted was to get home, kick off her shoes, and maybe order some takeout. Her black sedan hummed smoothly down the two-lane road. The traffic was light, just a few cars here and there. Victoria's mind was already planning her evening when she noticed the police cruiser in her rearview mirror. At first, she didn't think much of it. Cops were everywhere on this stretch of road. But then the lights came on, flashing red and blue in the growing darkness. Victoria's stomach tightened slightly. She checked her speedometer. She wasn't speeding. Her brake lights worked fine. She'd renewed her registration last month. Still, she pulled over to the shoulder, putting on her hazard lights like she was supposed to. Years of training kicked in automatically. She knew the drill, probably better than most people. The officer who climbed out of his patrol car moved slowly, deliberately. His name tag read Officer Kent Bradley. He'd been on the force for 15 years, and it showed in the way he carried himself. Confident, maybe too confident. His hand rested on his belt close to his weapon as he approached her window. Victoria rolled down her window halfway, keeping her hands visible on the steering wheel. That's what they taught everyone to do, but for her it was more than just advice. It was survival. "Evening, officer," she said calmly. "Can I ask why you pulled me over?" Bradley leaned down, shining his flashlight directly into her face even though there was still plenty of daylight left. His eyes scanned the interior of her car, looking for something, anything. "Your taillight's out," he said flatly. Victoria knew that wasn't true. She'd just had her car serviced 3 days ago. Everything was working perfectly. But she also knew that arguing on the side of the road never ended well for anyone. "I wasn't aware of that, officer. I'll get it fixed first thing tomorrow," she replied, keeping her voice level and professional. "License and registration," Bradley demanded, his tone sharp. "Of course. I'm going to reach into my glove compartment for my registration, and then I'll get my license from my purse. I also need to let you know that I'm a federal agent and I'm carrying a service weapon." The moment those words left her mouth, Victoria saw Bradley's entire demeanor change. His jaw clenched. His hand moved closer to his gun. The flashlight beam became steadier, more focused. "Federal agent?" he repeated, his voice dripping with skepticism. "That right?" "Yes, sir. I have my credentials with my license. I'm reaching for them now, very slowly." Victoria moved with deliberate care, her movements smooth and predictable. She opened the glove compartment, retrieved her registration, and then reached for her purse on the passenger seat. Inside was her FBI badge and identification card, the same ones she'd carried for over a decade. But when she handed everything through the window, Bradley barely glanced at them. Instead, he stared at her face, then back at the badge, then at her again. "These look fake," he announced. Victoria felt her heart rate increase slightly, but she kept her expression neutral. She'd dealt with difficult people before. That was part of the job. "Officer, I assure you they're genuine. You can call the Atlanta field office to verify my credentials if you'd like. The number's right there on the card." "Step out of the vehicle," Bradley ordered. "May I ask why?" "Step out of the vehicle, now. This was going wrong." Victoria could feel it in her bones. Every instinct she'd developed over 12 years was screaming at her that this situation was escalating for no good reason. But she also knew that refusing to comply would only make things worse. "I'm opening my door now," she said clearly, hoping that somewhere his body camera was recording this. "I'm stepping out slowly. My weapon is holstered on my right hip." As she emerged from the car, Victoria noticed something else. Other cars were slowing down as they passed. A few people had their phones out recording. In this day and age, everything was documented. That thought gave her a small measure of comfort. Bradley positioned himself aggressively, his stance wide and confrontational. "Put your hands on the hood." Victoria complied, placing her palms flat on the warm metal of her car. The sun had heated it throughout the day, and now it burned slightly against her skin. "Officer Bradley, I'm a federal agent with the FBI. My credentials are legitimate. I've committed no crime. I'm happy to cooperate, but I don't understand what's happening here." "You don't tell me what's happening," Bradley snapped. "I tell you." Another patrol car pulled up behind Bradley's cruiser. His backup had arrived. Officer Chen stepped out, a younger cop who immediately seemed confused by the scene in front of him. What's going on? Chen asked Bradley. Suspect claims to be FBI. Credentials look fake. I'm detaining her for further investigation. I'm not a suspect, Victoria said firmly but calmly. I'm Special Agent Victoria Hayes, badge number 2847. I work in the Civil Rights Division of the FBI. Officer Chen, you can verify this with one phone call. Chen looked uncertain. He approached and examined Victoria's credentials more carefully than Bradley had. These look real to me, he said quietly to Bradley. I'm the senior officer here. I'm making the call, Bradley responded sharply. The situation was absurd and Victoria knew it. She also knew that absurd situations could turn deadly in seconds. She'd investigated enough cases to know how fast things could spiral. People had died over less. A minivan slowed almost to a stop. The woman driving had her phone pointed at the scene. You okay? She called out. Keep moving, Bradley shouted at her. This is police business, but the woman didn't move quickly. She kept filming, her camera capturing everything. Victoria's phone rang in her pocket. The sudden sound cut through the tension like a knife. She felt it vibrate against her leg. Don't move, Bradley commanded. It's just my phone, Victoria explained. It's probably my office. I was supposed to check in an hour ago. The phone kept ringing, once, twice, 3 times. Victoria remained perfectly still, her hands on the hood, knowing that any movement could be misinterpreted. Bradley was breathing heavily now. His hand had moved from his belt to actually rest on his holster. Officer Chen looked increasingly uncomfortable, stepping back slightly. Officer Bradley, Chen said carefully, maybe we should just verify her credentials. It'll take 2 minutes. I don't need a rookie telling me how to do my job, Bradley shot back. The phone finally stopped ringing. In the silence that followed, Victoria could hear her own heartbeat. She'd faced down armed criminals before. She'd been in shootouts and hostage situations. But this felt different. This felt wrong in a way that made her skin crawl. I'm going to need you to answer some questions, Bradley said, moving around to face her, starting with where you really got that badge. I didn't get it anywhere. It was issued to me by the Federal Bureau of Investigation after I graduated from Quantico 12 years ago. I've served my country faithfully since then. Officer, whatever you think is happening here, you're wrong. I am who I say I am. But looking into Bradley's eyes, Victoria realized something that chilled her to the core. It didn't matter what she said. It didn't matter what proof she showed. He'd already made up his mind about who she was and what she represented. And nothing she could say or do was going to change that. The sun had almost completely set now. The streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows across the road. More cars were slowing down. More phones were recording. Whatever happened next, the world would see it. Victoria just hoped she'd live long enough to tell her side of the story. Victoria's phone started ringing again. The vibration in her pocket felt like thunder in the tense silence. She remained frozen, hands still flat on the hood of her car, not daring to move an inch. Show me your hands, Bradley barked. My hands are visible, sir. They're right here on the hood, Victoria replied, her voice steady despite the fear creeping through her body. I said, show me your hands. Victoria's training was screaming at her. Nothing about this made sense. Her hands were in plain sight. She was following every instruction. But Bradley seemed to be operating on a different reality, one where she was a threat that needed to be neutralized. Officer Chen stepped forward cautiously. Bradley, her hands are visible. Maybe we should just call this in and verify her credentials. Stay back, Bradley snapped at his partner. His voice had taken on a strange quality, higher pitched than before. His breathing was rapid, almost panicked. To anyone watching, it was clear who was actually afraid in this situation. A pickup truck slowed down on the road. The driver rolled down his window. Everything all right here, officers? Move along, Bradley shouted without taking his eyes off Victoria. But his hand was shaking now as it hovered over his weapon. Victoria had seen this before in her years investigating police misconduct. The tunnel vision, the escalation, the point where an officer's fear and prejudice override their training and common sense. She'd documented it in reports, testified about it in court. She never imagined she'd be on the receiving end. Officer Bradley, she said slowly and clearly, I need you to listen to me. Take a breath. Nothing bad is happening here. I'm a federal agent. I'm cooperating fully. There's no threat, no danger. We can resolve this calmly. For a split second, she thought she might be getting through to him. His eyes seemed to clear slightly as if he was seeing her as a person rather than whatever threat he'd built up in his mind. But then, her phone rang again. The sound made Bradley flinch. His whole body jerked with surprise, and in that moment everything Victoria had feared came rushing toward her like a freight train. "It's just my phone," she said quickly, her voice urgent now. "It's in my pocket. I'm not reaching for it. I'm not moving. It's just ringing." "Show me what's in your pocket," Bradley demanded. "Sir, if I reach for my pocket, you need to understand that I'm reaching for my phone. Nothing else. Just my phone. Hands behind your head." Victoria lifted her hands from the hood, moving them slowly upward and behind her head. Her weapon remained holstered at her hip. She hadn't touched it. Hadn't even thought about it. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was an FBI agent, trained in tactical response, and she was more terrified in this moment than she'd been facing actual criminals. The phone kept ringing. 5 rings, 6, 7. "Turn around," Bradley ordered. Victoria turned slowly, her hands still behind her head. Now she could see Bradley's face clearly. His pupils were dilated, sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool evening air. His gun was drawn now, pointed directly at her chest. Officer Chen had his hand on his own weapon but hadn't drawn it. His face showed pure confusion and concern. "Bradley, what are you doing?" "She's complying with everything. She's not resisting." "I know what I'm doing," Bradley said, but his voice suggested otherwise. Several cars had now stopped completely on the road. At least 6 or 7 phones were recording the scene. Victoria could see the faces behind those phones. Some looked shocked. Some looked angry. One elderly woman had tears streaming down her face. The phone finally stopped ringing. In the sudden quiet, Victoria heard Bradley's rapid breathing, the distant hum of traffic and her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. "Officer, please lower your weapon," Victoria said. "This situation doesn't require this level of force. I've given you no reason to fear for your safety." "That's not for you to decide," Bradley responded. "Then let's call your supervisor. Right now. Let's get someone else here who can help us sort this out." Bradley's jaw clenched. "I don't need a supervisor. I need you to comply with my lawful orders." "I am complying. I have been complying. I've done everything you've asked." The phone started ringing again, 3rd time. Whoever was calling wasn't giving up. It was probably her partner at the field office, wondering why she hadn't checked in. Standard procedure. They'd be worried by now. The ringing seemed impossibly loud in the tense air. Victoria saw Bradley's finger move closer to the trigger. "Don't answer that," he said. "I'm not. I'm standing perfectly still." But the ringing continued on, and Victoria could see Bradley's control slipping with each ring. His hands were shaking. His breathing was getting faster. He was working himself into a state where anything could happen. "Officer Bradley," Chen said, his voice urgent now. "We need to call this in, right now. Something's not right here. I said I've got this under control." But nothing was under control. Victoria could see it. Chen could see it. The people recording could see it. The only person who couldn't see it was Bradley himself, trapped in whatever fear and prejudice had taken over his mind. Victoria tried one more time. "My name is Victoria Hayes. I'm a human being. I'm a daughter, a sister, a federal agent who's served this country for 12 years. I pose no threat to you. Please just lower your weapon and let's talk this through." For just a moment, she thought she saw something human in Bradley's eyes. A flicker of doubt, a question. But then the phone in her pocket shifted slightly as it rang, creating the smallest movement in her jacket. Everything happened in slow motion after that. Bradley's eyes widened. His finger squeezed. Victoria saw the muzzle flash before she heard the sound. The bullet hit her in the shoulder, spinning her around. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, like someone had driven a hot spike through her body. She stumbled, fell to her knees, then collapsed onto the pavement. The screaming started immediately. The woman in the minivan, the man in the pickup truck. Even Officer Chen shouted something, but Victoria couldn't make out the words over the ringing in her ears. She felt the rough pavement against her cheek. Warm blood was spreading across her shirt. Her vision was getting blurry, but through it all, her training was still there, telling her to stay conscious, stay aware. Bradley was on his radio. "Shots fired. Officer needs assistance. Suspect down. Suspect." The word cut through Victoria's pain like another bullet. She wasn't a suspect. She'd never been a suspect. She was a victim. Chen was at her side immediately. pressing his hands against her wound. "Stay with me," he said urgently. "Ambulance is on the way. You're going to be okay." Victoria managed to speak, though every word hurt. "My badge." "In my jacket. Left inside pocket." Chen reached carefully into her jacket and pulled out the leather wallet containing her FBI credentials. He flipped it open and Victoria saw his face go pale. "Oh God," he whispered. "She really is FBI, Bradley, she's really FBI." More sirens were approaching now, the backup that Bradley had called for. But as they got closer, Victoria knew this was about to become something much bigger than a traffic stop gone wrong. She tried to stay focused, but the pain and shock were pulling her under. Her last clear thought before the darkness started closing in was about the absurdity of it all. She'd spent 12 years protecting people, fighting for justice, putting her life on the line. And now she'd been shot by someone who was supposed to be on the same side. When the first responding officers arrived, they found Chen still applying pressure to Victoria's wound while Bradley stood several feet away, his gun now holstered, looking at his hands as if he couldn't quite believe what they'd done. One of the responding officers, a sergeant named Phillips, took immediate control of the scene. "What happened here?" "Traffic stop," Bradley started to say. She didn't reach for anything," Chen interrupted, his voice shaking with anger and adrenaline. "She was complying with everything." Her hands were visible. "She's FBI, Phillips. She's a federal agent and he shot her for no reason." Phillips's expression hardened. He looked at Bradley, then at Victoria lying on the ground, then at the phone still recording from the stopped cars. "Separate them," Phillips ordered. "Bradley, you're not to speak to anyone until we sort this out. Chen, stay with the victim. Where's that ambulance?" As if in answer, the wail of an approaching ambulance cut through the night. The paramedics worked quickly, stabilizing Victoria and loading her onto a stretcher. As they lifted her into the ambulance, she managed to open her eyes one more time. She saw Bradley being led to a patrol car, his head down. She saw the crowd of witnesses, their phones still recording. She saw the flashing lights painting everything in red and blue. And she knew, with the certainty that came from 12 years of investigating crimes, that this night was going to change everything. The ambulance doors closed and they rushed her toward the hospital. In the darkness, with the pain pulsing through her body and the sirens screaming overhead, Victoria Hayes held on to one thought. She was alive. And as long as she was alive, there would be justice. Victoria woke up in the hospital 3 hours after surgery. The first thing she saw was her supervisor, Agent Raymond Torres, sitting in the chair beside her bed. His face looked older than she remembered, lines of stress and anger carved deep into his forehead. "Hey," she managed to croak out, her throat dry from the anesthesia. Raymond leaned forward immediately. "Don't try to talk too much. You're going to be okay. The bullet went through clean. No permanent damage. You got lucky." Lucky? Victoria would have laughed if it wouldn't have hurt so much. Lucky was not getting shot in the first place. "Bradley?" she asked. Raymond's expression darkened. "Suspended pending investigation. But Victoria, you need to know something. This is already bigger than just one bad traffic stop. Way bigger." Over the next hour, as Victoria drifted in and out of consciousness, Raymond explained what was happening. The videos from witnesses had already gone viral. Millions of views in just a few hours. The FBI had immediately launched a full investigation, not just into the shooting, but into Bradley's entire career. And what they were finding was painting a picture that made Victoria's stomach turn. By the morning, when Victoria was finally alert enough to really focus, a team of investigators had set up shop. They treated her hospital room like a field office, bringing in laptops and files, coordinating with the local police department and the Department of Justice. Agent Lisa Park, from the Civil Rights Division, pulled up a chair beside Victoria's bed. "I know you're recovering, but we need to know everything that happened. Every detail you can remember." Victoria walked them through it. The traffic stop, Bradley's immediate hostility, his refusal to accept her credentials, the escalation, the phone ringing, the shot. She remembered it all with painful clarity. "Your account matches the video evidence perfectly," Lisa said. "But there's more. Victoria, how many complaints do you think Officer Bradley has had filed against him during his career?" Victoria thought about it. In her experience investigating police misconduct, problem officers usually had a trail of complaints. 20, 30, 47, Lisa said quietly. 47 formal complaints in 15 years. And you want to know how many resulted in any meaningful discipline? Victoria already knew the answer. None. 2 written reprimands. That's it. Everything else was either dismissed or buried. And Victoria, almost all of those complaints came from black citizens. Allegations of excessive force, illegal searches, harassment, racial profiling. The pattern is clear as day. Over the next few days, as Victoria's body healed, the investigation kept uncovering more. Bradley's body camera footage was analyzed frame by use of force experts. Their conclusion was damning. Bradley had created the dangerous situation himself through his aggressive escalation. Victoria had done everything right. She'd identified herself clearly. She'd moved slowly and predictably. She'd kept her hands visible. She'd posed no threat whatsoever. But the worst discoveries came from Bradley's digital life. Investigators obtained warrants for his phone, his computer, his social media accounts. What they found made even seasoned agents uncomfortable. Raymond showed Victoria some of the evidence on his tablet, warning her first that it would be upsetting. Text messages with other officers where Bradley joked about catching thugs and used racial slurs. Social media posts expressing anger about Black Lives Matter protests and celebrating when suspects were killed by police. He was part of several online groups known for sharing extremist views about race. There's more, Raymond said, scrolling through the files. We found posts where he bragged about pulling over black drivers for minor violations just to mess with them.
He called it keeping the streets clean. Victoria, this guy is exactly the kind of officer you've been investigating and testifying about for years. The irony was almost too bitter to swallow.
Victoria had dedicated her career to fighting against officers like Bradley. She'd built cases, gathered evidence, helped send corrupt cops to prison. She'd testified before Congress about the need for police reform. And now she was lying in a hospital bed because she'd encountered the very thing she'd been fighting against. But the investigation wasn't just about Bradley anymore. The FBI started looking at the entire police department that had employed him for 15 years. How had someone with 47 complaints stayed on the force? Who had protected him? Who had looked the other way? They found a systemic pattern of misconduct being swept under the rug. Internal affairs investigations that were perfunctory at best. Supervisors who routinely sided with officers over civilians. A culture that valued loyalty to fellow cops over accountability to the public. Agent Park came back with more findings. We've been interviewing people who filed complaints against Bradley over the years. The stories are heartbreaking. A high school teacher pulled over for a broken taillight, searched illegally, then arrested for resisting when he asked why. A nurse detained for 20 minutes because Bradley said her car matched a description, but the car she drove was nothing like what he claimed. A college student roughed up during a traffic stop and threatened when he tried to file a complaint. All of them black? Victoria asked, though she already knew the answer. Every single one. And you know what else? We pulled Bradley's traffic stop data. Over the past 5 years, he's pulled over black drivers at a rate 4 times higher than their percentage of the population in his district. And his stops of black drivers were 3 times more likely to result in searches, even though his rate of finding contraband was actually lower. The statistical evidence was overwhelming. Bradley wasn't just a cop who'd made a mistake. He was a cop who'd built a career on racial discrimination, protected by a system that refused to hold him accountable. Meanwhile, the public response was growing. Protests had erupted in the city where the shooting happened. Not violent protests, but thousands of people marching peacefully, demanding accountability. They carried signs with Victoria's name and her FBI badge number. They chanted for justice. News coverage was constant. Legal experts analyzed the case on television, many saying this could be a watershed moment for police accountability. Civil rights organizations called for federal charges. Even politicians who normally defended police in every situation were being forced to condemn Bradley's actions because the evidence was so clear. Victoria's hospital room became a gathering place for FBI agents from across the country. Some she knew well, others she'd never met. They came to show support, to tell her she wasn't alone, to promise that this time would be different. One agent, a veteran named Thomas Wright, who'd been with the Bureau for 30 years, sat with Victoria one evening as the sun set outside her window. "I've seen a lot in my career," he said quietly. "Seen good cops and bad cops, seen the system work and seen it fail spectacularly. But this, Victoria, This has the potential to actually change things. You know why? Victoria shook her head. Because you're one of us. You're FBI. You did everything right and you still got shot. If it can happen to you with your training and your badge and your knowledge of the law, then it proves what we've been saying all along. The problem isn't people not complying. The problem is officers who have no business wearing a badge. 2 weeks after the shooting, the FBI released a preliminary report. It was devastating in its conclusions. Bradley had violated multiple policies and procedures. His use of force was unjustified and excessive. His conduct throughout the traffic stop demonstrated bias and a pattern consistent with racial profiling. The report recommended federal charges. But beyond Bradley himself, the report called for a full civil rights investigation into the entire police department. It detailed how the department's failure to discipline Bradley and other problem officers had created an environment where constitutional violations were routine. The police chief resigned the day the report was released. So did the head of internal affairs. The mayor announced that the department would be placed under federal oversight. It wasn't enough for some people, but it was a start. Victoria was finally discharged from the hospital 3 weeks after the shooting. She went home to her apartment, which now felt different somehow, smaller, less safe. She'd been shot on a public road doing nothing wrong. Where was safe anymore? Physical therapy helped her shoulder heal, but the emotional wounds were harder to address. She had nightmares about the traffic stop. Sometimes in the dreams, Bradley's shot hit her in the chest instead of the shoulder. Sometimes she bled out on the pavement before the ambulance arrived. Sometimes she woke up sweating, her heart racing, reliving those terrifying moments when she'd seen his finger on the trigger. The FBI offered her counseling, which she accepted. The therapist helped her work through the trauma, but he also told her something that stuck with her. "What happened to you was wrong," he said. "Deeply, fundamentally wrong. But you survived, and now you get to decide what that survival means. You can let this break you, or you can use it to fight even harder for the changes you believe in." Victoria thought about all the people Bradley had mistreated over the years. The ones who hadn't had an FBI badge to prove their credibility. The ones whose videos hadn't gone viral. The ones who'd been arrested or beaten or humiliated and had no recourse because the system protected officers like Bradley. She thought about her 12 years investigating civil rights violations. All the cases she'd built. All the testimony she'd given. All the families she'd met who'd lost loved ones to police violence. And she made a decision. This wasn't going to break her. This was going to make her stronger. Because now she wasn't just an investigator. She was a survivor. And she had a story that could change minds, change laws, maybe even change the system itself. 6 months after that terrible night on the roadside, Victoria found herself walking into a federal courthouse. Her shoulder still ached sometimes, especially when it rained. But today the pain was different. Today was the first day of Officer Kent Bradley's trial, and Victoria was ready. The charges were serious. Attempted murder, deprivation of rights under color of law, filing a false police report. Each one carried significant prison time. The prosecution team, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Patricia Nguyen, had built their case methodically over the past months. They had everything they needed. Video evidence from multiple angles, expert testimony, Bradley's history of complaints, his racist text messages and social media posts. It was, as Patricia had told Victoria, as close to a slam dunk as federal prosecutors ever got. But trials were never certain. And this one had attracted national attention. The courthouse was surrounded by news trucks. Reporters lined the steps. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Civil rights activists sat alongside FBI agents. Bradley's fellow officers filled several rows, their faces carefully neutral. And in the front row of the public gallery sat Victoria's family. Her mother, her 2 brothers, and her sister, all taking time off work to support her. Bradley sat at the defense table looking smaller than Victoria remembered. He wore a suit instead of his uniform. His attorney, a veteran defense lawyer named Robert Sinclair, had already been making the rounds on television, arguing that Bradley had feared for his life and had responded as any reasonable officer would. Judge Martha Rodriguez called the court to order. She was a no-nonsense jurist with a reputation for running a tight courtroom. Victoria had testified in front of her before on other cases and respected her deeply. The jury selection had taken 2 full days. They'd ended up with 7 women and 5 men. diverse in age and background. During voir dire, Patricia had asked each potential juror whether they could hold a police officer to the same standard as any other citizen. Several potential jurors had been dismissed when they'd suggested that cops deserved special consideration. Patricia stood to give her opening statement. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, but her presence filled the courtroom. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about a simple but profound truth. No one is above the law. Not you, not me, and certainly not someone who has sworn an oath to uphold that law. On the evening of April 15th, Officer Kent Bradley pulled over Special Agent Victoria Hayes for a supposed traffic violation. What happened next was not law enforcement, it was a crime. Patricia walked the jury through the timeline. The traffic stop. Bradley's refusal to accept Victoria's credentials. The escalation. The shooting. She showed them still images from the videos. Frozen moments that captured Victoria with her hands visible. No weapon drawn, posing no threat. The defense will try to tell you that Officer Bradley feared for his life. But fear does not justify unlawful actions. And when you see the evidence, when you hear the testimony, you'll understand that this wasn't about fear at all. This was about prejudice. This was about an officer who had spent 15 years treating citizens differently, based on the color of their skin. And on April 15th, that prejudice nearly killed a federal agent. When it was Sinclair's turn, he approached the jury with a sympathetic expression. Officer Bradley made a mistake. He admits that. But a mistake made in the heat of the moment under stress is not a crime. Police officers face split-second decisions every day. They have to make judgments about threats, about danger, about who might be reaching for a weapon. Sometimes they get it wrong. That's tragic, but it's not criminal. Victoria watched the jurors' faces as Sinclair spoke. Some seemed skeptical. Others looked thoughtful. This was why trials were necessary, because even with overwhelming evidence, people needed to hear both sides and make their own judgments. The prosecution's case unfolded over the next 2 weeks. They started with the basics. Officer Chen testified about arriving at the scene and seeing Victoria with her hands visible on the hood of her car. He described how Bradley had seemed agitated, how he'd refused to accept Victoria's credentials as genuine. Did you have any doubt that her FBI badge was real? Patricia asked Chen. No, ma'am. It looked exactly like the federal credentials I've seen before, and she acted exactly like what she said she was. Calm, professional, compliant. So why do you think Officer Bradley didn't believe her? Sinclair objected before Chen could answer, and the judge sustained it. But the implication hung in the air anyway. The video evidence came next. The jury watched footage from Bradley's body camera, from Chen's camera, and from 4 different witnesses who'd recorded on their phones. They saw the same scene from multiple angles. Victoria being respectful, Bradley being hostile, Victoria keeping her hands visible, Bradley drawing his weapon, the phone ringing, the shot. Several jurors flinched when they saw Victoria fall. One woman in the back row wiped tears from her eyes. Dr. Andrew Foster, a use of force expert who'd trained police departments across the country, took the stand to analyze what had happened. Patricia walked him through each moment of the encounter. In your expert opinion, did Special Agent Hayes pose a threat to Officer Bradley? No, absolutely not. She followed every protocol. She announced herself clearly. She moved slowly and predictably. She kept her hands visible at all times. There was no threat. What about when her phone rang? A phone ringing is not a threat. Officer Bradley created the danger himself through his aggressive escalation. He gave contradictory commands. He refused to de-escalate. He turned a routine traffic stop into a life-threatening situation for no legitimate law enforcement reason. Sinclair cross-examined Dr. Foster aggressively, trying to get him to admit that officers sometimes have to make difficult decisions based on incomplete information. But Dr. Foster wouldn't budge. Officer Bradley had complete information. He had Agent Hayes' credentials. He had her calm demeanor. He had her complete cooperation. What he didn't have was judgment. The prosecution then called witness after witness who'd filed complaints against Bradley over the years. A teacher who'd been illegally searched. A businessman who'd been detained for 30 minutes for no reason. A young mother who'd been pulled over while her baby cried in the back seat and was made to stand in the rain. While Bradley searched her car, all of them were black. All of them described similar patterns of behavior, hostility, disrespect, excessive force, or threats of force. And all of them had filed complaints that went nowhere. After you filed your complaint, what happened? Patricia asked the teacher. Nothing. Internal Affairs said they investigated, but I never heard anything. Then 3 months later, Bradley pulled me over again. He recognized me. He said, "You the one who complained about me?" Then he wrote me a ticket for not using my turn signal even though I had. It felt like retaliation. The pattern was clear. Bradley had been protected by his department despite a long history of misconduct. And that protection had allowed him to continue his behavior until it finally escalated to shooting a federal agent. Perhaps the most damaging evidence came from Bradley's own digital trail. The prosecution introduced text messages where Bradley referred to black citizens with slurs, social media posts where he celebrated when suspects were killed by police, comments in online forums where he complained about having to be politically correct when dealing with minorities. Patricia read one text message aloud to the jury. Pulled over another one today. Made him sweat for 20 minutes before I let him go. Gotta keep them scared. The jury looked disgusted. Even Bradley's attorney looked uncomfortable. Then came Victoria's testimony. She'd been dreading this moment, but she was ready. Patricia led her through her career, establishing her credentials and experience. 12 years with the FBI, commendations for her work, expertise in civil rights investigations. Then they moved to that night. Tell the jury what happened when Officer Bradley approached your car. Victoria took a deep breath and began. She spoke clearly and calmly, describing every detail. How Bradley had seemed hostile from the start. How he'd refused to believe her credentials. How she'd done everything right and it hadn't mattered. When your phone started ringing, what did you do? Nothing. I kept my hands visible. I told Officer Bradley it was just my phone. I wasn't reaching for it. I was standing perfectly still. Were you afraid? Yes, Victoria admitted. I'd investigated cases like this before. I knew how fast things could go wrong. I was terrified that I was going to die on the side of that road for no reason. What went through your mind when you saw Officer Bradley's finger on the trigger? Victoria's voice broke slightly. I thought about my family, my mother, my brothers and sister. I thought about all the families I'd met during my investigations, families who'd lost loved ones to police violence. And I thought about how unfair it was that I'd spent my whole career trying to stop this from happening to people. And now it was happening to me. Sinclair's cross-examination was gentle, perhaps because he knew the jury was sympathetic to Victoria. He tried to suggest that Victoria might have made movements she didn't remember, that in stressful situations people's perceptions could be unreliable. But Victoria had the video evidence on her side. Every claim she made was backed up by multiple camera angles. The prosecution rested after 3 weeks of testimony. The defense case was much shorter. Sinclair called other police officers who testified that split-second decisions were difficult. He called a psychologist who talked about the stress of police work. But he never called Bradley to testify, probably because Patricia would have destroyed him on cross-examination. The closing arguments came on a Friday afternoon. Patricia reminded the jury of everything they'd seen and heard. The videos, the history of complaints, the racist messages, Victoria's complete cooperation. Officer Bradley didn't make a mistake, Patricia concluded. He made a choice to see Special Agent Hayes as a threat because of the color of her skin, a choice to escalate rather than de-escalate, a choice to pull the trigger when there was no justification. And now you must make a choice. Will you hold him accountable for those choices? Or will you send a message that police officers are above the law? Sinclair made his final appeal to give Bradley the benefit of the doubt. He's human. He made an error in judgment. But that's not the same as a crime. Judge Rodriguez gave the jury their instructions and sent them to deliberate. It was late afternoon, so she told them they could start fresh on Monday morning. Victoria spent the weekend barely sleeping. She knew the evidence was strong, but juries were unpredictable, and convicting a police officer was always difficult, even with overwhelming proof. Monday morning came, then Monday afternoon, then Tuesday. The jury deliberated for 3 full days. Every hour that passed made Victoria more nervous. Long deliberations sometimes meant acquittals, but finally on Tuesday afternoon the word came. The jury had reached a verdict. Victoria sat in the front row of the courtroom, her family behind her, FBI agents all around. Bradley sat at the defense table, his face pale. The courtroom was absolutely silent as the jury filed back in. Victoria tried to read their faces, looking for any hint of what was coming. Some looked solemn. Others looked tired. The foreperson, a retired teacher named Mrs. Chen, carried the verdict forms with steady hands. Judge Rodriguez addressed the jury. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor," Mrs. Chen replied. "On the charge of attempted murder, how do you find the defendant?" "Guilty." The word seemed to echo through the courtroom. Victoria felt her mother grab her hand from behind. She heard someone gasp. Bradley's shoulders slumped at the defense table. "On the charge of deprivation of rights under color of law, how do you find the defendant?" "Guilty." "On the charge of filing a false police report, how do you find the defendant?" "Guilty." 3 guilty verdicts. On every count. Victoria felt tears streaming down her face, but she wasn't sure if they were tears of relief or something more complicated. This wasn't really about Bradley anymore. It was about every person he'd harmed over 15 years. Every complaint that had been ignored. Every time the system had protected him instead of the people he'd sworn to serve. Bradley sat motionless as the judge polled each juror individually. 12 times, 12 different people confirmed their guilty verdicts. There was no doubt, no disagreement. The evidence had been too overwhelming. Judge Rodriguez set a sentencing date for 6 weeks later and remanded Bradley to custody immediately. As the marshals led him away in handcuffs, he finally showed emotion. Not remorse exactly, but something like shock, as if he genuinely couldn't believe he was being held accountable. Outside the courthouse, reporters mobbed Victoria and the prosecution team. Patricia made a brief statement about justice being served and no one being above the law. Victoria said simply, "I hope this sends a message that we can't tolerate this behavior from those who are sworn to protect us." But the real work wasn't finished. The trial had been about Bradley's individual actions. The sentencing would be about what those actions meant for society as a whole. Over the next 6 weeks, Victoria prepared a victim impact statement. She wrote draft after draft, trying to find the right words. This wasn't just about her injury or her trauma. It was about systemic change. It was about making sure that what happened to her never happened to anyone else. The sentencing hearing arrived on a cold Monday morning in November. The courtroom was packed again. Victoria's entire family came. So did FBI Director James Mitchell, making a rare personal appearance to show institutional support. Civil rights leaders from across the country filled the gallery. And sitting in the back rows were many of the people who'd filed complaints against Bradley over the years. People who'd never gotten justice until now. Judge Rodriguez asked if anyone wanted to speak before sentencing. Victoria stood up, her statement in hand. Her voice was steady as she began. "Your Honor, 6 months ago I was shot doing nothing wrong. I was a federal agent, driving home after work, pulled over for a traffic violation that didn't exist. I identified myself clearly. I followed every instruction. I posed no threat, and yet Officer Bradley shot me anyway." She paused, looking directly at Bradley, who kept his eyes down. "I've spent 12 years investigating cases exactly like mine. I've met with families who lost loved ones to police violence. I've reviewed body camera footage of unnecessary shootings. I've testified before Congress about the need for accountability. I thought I understood what those families went through. I was wrong. Until you experience that moment when you see a finger on a trigger pointed at you for no reason, you can't truly understand the terror." Victoria's voice grew stronger. "But I'm not here just to talk about what happened to me. I'm here to talk about everyone Officer Bradley harmed during his career. The teacher he illegally searched, the businessman he detained without cause, the mother he made stand in the rain, the countless people he pulled over because of the color of their skin. All the people who filed complaints that were ignored, all the people who were told that their word didn't matter against an officer's." She turned to address the judge directly. Officer Bradley had 47 complaints filed against him. 47 times citizens tried to hold him accountable, and 47 times the system failed them. It only stopped when he shot someone with an FBI badge, someone whose credentials couldn't be dismissed or ignored. That's not justice. That's proof that the system is broken. Victoria took a breath. "I'm asking you to send a message today. A message that, badge or no badge, everyone has to follow the law. A message that police officers who abuse their authority will face real consequences. A message to every officer like Bradley out there that this behavior will not be tolerated anymore." She sat down to complete silence. Then, one by one, other victims stood to speak. The teacher described how Bradley's harassment had made him afraid to drive in his own neighborhood. The businessman talked about the violation he felt being treated like a criminal when he'd done nothing wrong. The mother described her baby screaming in the car seat while Bradley searched her vehicle in the rain. Each story added to the weight of evidence showing that Bradley's shooting of Victoria wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of 15 years of misconduct, protected by a system that valued officer solidarity over community safety. The prosecution recommended a 25-year sentence, one of the harshest ever sought for an officer in an on-duty shooting. The defense asked for leniency, arguing that Bradley had a family and had served the community for years. Judge Rodriguez listened to everything. Then she began her sentencing remarks. "I've been a judge for 18 years. I've sentenced murderers, drug dealers, violent criminals of every type. But this case disturbs me more than most because Officer Bradley's crimes were committed under the color of law. He was given a badge, a gun, and the authority to enforce our laws, and he used that authority to terrorize citizens based on the color of their skin." The judge reviewed the evidence in detail, the complaints, the text messages, the social media posts, the pattern of behavior that showed Bradley wasn't a good officer who made a mistake, but a bad officer who should never have been given a badge in the first place. The question before me is what sentence reflects the seriousness of these crimes. Some might argue that Officer Bradley deserves leniency because he served as a police officer. I disagree. His position of authority makes his crimes more serious, not less. He betrayed the oath he took. He violated the trust the public placed in him. And he nearly killed a federal agent who was doing everything right. Judge Rodriguez looked at Bradley. "You had 47 chances to change your behavior. 47 complaints that should have been a wake-up call. Instead, you continued down the same path until you finally faced a victim who couldn't be ignored. Your actions demonstrate a complete disregard for the constitutional rights of citizens and a shocking level of racial prejudice." The judge announced her sentence: 25 years in federal prison. No possibility of parole. Bradley would be nearly 70 when released. The courtroom erupted in reaction. Some people cheered. Others cried. Bradley's family sobbed in the back. Victoria sat quietly, feeling a complex mix of emotions: relief, sadness, a strange kind of emptiness. This wasn't really victory. It was just accountability. Finally, after so many years of none. After the hearing, Victoria stood on the courthouse steps, surrounded by reporters. "This sentence isn't about revenge," she said. "It's about establishing that we have standards, and those standards apply to everyone. I hope every police officer watching this understands that the badge doesn't put you above the law. It holds you to a higher standard." The months that followed brought significant changes. The police department where Bradley had worked was placed under federal oversight. New policies were implemented requiring immediate investigation of any complaint alleging racial bias. Officers with patterns of complaints were removed from duty. Training was overhauled to focus on de-escalation and implicit bias. But Victoria's work wasn't finished. She returned to the FBI, though she transferred to a new role focused on training and policy development. She traveled the country, speaking at police academies and law enforcement conferences. She showed the video of her shooting and walked officers through what Bradley had done wrong, and more importantly, what he should have done instead. "I'm not anti-police," she'd tell these audiences. "I work in law enforcement. I know how hard the job is, but that's exactly why we need to hold ourselves to the highest standards, because when we fail, people die, or they get shot on the side of the road doing nothing wrong.